Thank
Sorry
you.
about that.
All right.
Okay, so thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to be part of this wonderful event, and to SGSAH for supporting my research. As you've heard, I'm a second-year doctoral researcher at St Andrews and Glasgow, and I'm investigating how different kinds of sensory experiences with archaeological collections contribute to memory formation and well-being among people affected by dementia. Now, my research follows on from two separate visitor studies projects run at the University of St Andrews, Through a Glass Darkly and Memory for Museum Exhibits, which I worked on as a museum professional with two of my current supervisors, Professor Rebecca Sweetman and Dr. Akira O'Connor. And we brought in a wide variety of audience groups and essentially set up some experiments that encouraged them to play about with both digital 3D models on screen, look at original artifacts and display cases and handle them, and in the original project to also touch physical replicas without seeing them in a Feely box. And we compared how these approaches affected their perceptions of archaeology and ability to subsequently recall the objects they'd encountered. The key findings were that the predominantly visual forms of presentation encouraged them to focus very much on the aesthetic value of the artifacts. So display cases and 3D models in particular had that effect, whereas handling the objects drew their attention to the physical properties, the textures, the materials, the way that things felt in the hands, and you saw them turning them around to see how they were originally used. And that in itself led to a much deeper consideration of the artifacts in their original context and what they may be meant for the people who'd made and used them. Most importantly, the multi-sensory nature of object handling also improved subsequent recall of the objects and the information we presented alongside them. So taking this a step further, my doctoral research will focus on people living with dementia to ask firstly whether object handling consistently improves engagement and cognitive function, and also whether physical and digital approaches have different effects on well-being. Thirdly, how suitable are these approaches for both the people with dementia and their carers? And finally, I'm really intrigued to find out what might be special about using archaeology. So how might my results differ if I was to use something like this commemorative cup at the bottom compared to a Bronze Age communal drinking vessel? There's lots of examples of museums using social history collections for reminiscence purposes, but some researchers caution that it can put unhelpful pressure on people to remember specific facts like dates and faces and names and places, whereas using these kind of mystery objects can allow for a much more open-ended discussion and for people to make in-the-moment observations as they handle the object. And these questions are important because dementia is affecting record numbers of people. More than 920,000 people in the UK are currently living with dementia, and that's expected to rise to 1.6 million by 2040. Social prescribing schemes have demonstrated many benefits, including fewer GP visits, increased optimism about the future, and increased sociability. But as yet, there's very little data about the therapeutic value of using immersive technologies in heritage contexts for older people. Museums, as you know, already employ a wealth of exciting digital technologies to help visitors visualize and experience the past. And there are multiple definitions. So I've taken one that's really quite a general one here by Sue and Prof. And in my own work, I plan to use 3D digital models of artifacts produced using photogrammetry, like the example on the left from the University of St Andrews Cypriot collection, and then to also use some 360-degree visualizations of archaeological sites and museums. I'll also use motion-activated 2D projection as a stimulus for in-person group activity. So my methodology has been a bit of a moving picture. I had intended to run a kind of adapted version of a standard psychology recall test with individuals living in care homes, but with COVID-19 and lockdown, all sorts of things became extremely impractical. Obviously, care homes were closed even to immediate relatives and had all sorts of difficulties on their own hands. Experimentation in psychology also came to a halt in terms of face-to-face approaches. And I had no more access to the collection as buildings shut down. So I had this dilemma of how was I going to compare digital and physical encounters with artifacts if I only had a remote digital platform to work through, and would that actually give me any interesting, meaningful results? So to inform my decisions, I interviewed learning staff in museums that already had well-established programs for people living with dementia, to try and see how they transformed their activities for a digital setting, and to find out whether they'd managed to introduce any multi-sensory experiences. What this showed was there was some pretty innovative use of existing technology. For example, Alzheimer's Scotland has used Google Street View for reminiscing and literally taking people down memory lane. There's been a far greater choice of content, where previously people would have been limited to taking part in activities in their own geographical area. They now have huge amounts of different interests that they can follow up. It's also encouraged some older people to develop new digital skills, and played a very important role in combating the sense of isolation and loneliness. On the flip side, digital access has been patchy, with some care homes having very little at all. And also, individuals have varying levels of confidence, and it may be less appropriate for people in more advanced stages of dementia. The educators that I spoke to talked quite a lot about the challenges of facilitating a session remotely, where they're kind of missing out on a lot of the subtle visual cues of people's body language, and just missing out on that buzz of actually being with people and passing something around. They said that they were very reliant on the care home staff to have that practical presence facilitating the session. And sometimes they were obviously just too busy and could stay for the whole session. Also, safeguarding online, as I'm sure you're aware, is much more complex. So what I've taken from that is that whilst I might have to start with initial remote-only experiments, I can move on to in-person at a later stage. And it's clear that physical experiences are still possible, even through a kind of remote interaction. So lots of museums have managed to send out loan boxes with replica artifacts or handling artifacts, but it just means going through a more rigorous checking process and quarantining and disinfecting any material. So I think it's also clear that there's a lot of appetite out there for people to share very personal stories about objects in their own home. And so I want to incorporate all these things into a revised methodology, where I essentially get them to compare telling me stories about something they've selected in their home to an equivalent object, which I send out in a loan box. So I'll choose some items from charity shops, probably, for 20th century items. And then I'll send through some less familiar archaeological replicas. And we'll go on to a call and discuss those things. Then I'll do a similar method using virtual environments. So I've not begun my practical experiments yet, but I can summarize very briefly some arguments for and against using VR applications in the healthcare settings. It's been used very successfully to reduce pain and psychological disturbances, and provides an excellent form of escape from some of the kind of more monotonous routines and environments that you find in hospitals and institutions. And this has had a really positive effect on well-being, reducing the need to medicate. And that's obviously only going to be a good thing. However, there are some concerns that things like head-mounted VR sets could cause dizziness, disorientation, and confusion, and therefore compound some of the symptoms of dementia. But other researchers have talked about the fact that participants were actually very happy wearing headsets, but maybe just said it didn't feel very natural. More importantly, it tends to be more of a sedentary activity, so it's not really encouraging that kind of mobility and exercise that you would get through physically going outdoors to visit a place. And so it raises some important ethical questions. Can we be sure it's entirely for the benefit of the person with dementia, not driven by other agendas, for example, the profit of tech developers? Is there a risk of the person being left alone? Or on the other hand, is it being used in a really positive social way, perhaps involving lots of residents together, or relatives coming in to visit and running it as a group activity? So to conclude, immersive technology has enormous potential to bring stimulation from the outside world into the home. but caring, attentive facilitation is likely to be key to its success. And it will never replace real life experiences of spending time with loved ones, visiting favourite places, breathing fresh air, being active, curious, and engaging all of the senses. And funnily enough, these are essentially the 5 ways to well-being, which is a framework endorsed by both the NHS and the heritage sector. And if museums are to support the needs of a rapidly ageing population, then I think they need to develop both their digital and their in-person programmes with these values in mind. Thank you.